Kang Min-jae ordered an execution at 6:47 p.m. By 6:53 p.m., the order was carried out. By 7 p.m., he'd moved on to the next crisis. The man who had just died was already forgotten. Erasure was business. Mercy was weakness. Until 8:15 p.m. Until his eyes landed on the maid's ankle. He stopped walking. There was no threat in the hallway. No sound. Nothing but the soft whisper of her footsteps as she carried a tray past him. Eyes forward, invisible as air. But on her left ankle, just above the bone, tied with faded black thread and fastened with a tiny silver clasp, was an anklet. Not expensive. Not elegant. The kind of thing two hungry children make from found wire and string when the only currency they have is each other. The kind of thing that only one girl in the world had ever worn. The girl who was supposed to be dead. Kang Min-jae's mansion wasn't called the Iron Estate because of its architecture. It was called that because everyone who entered it knew they were walking into the headquarters of a man who had built an empire on absolute control. The staff didn't exist. They arrived before sunrise. They left after midnight. They moved through hallways like ghosts. No conversations, no laughter, no presence that might disturb the silence he required. Previous maids had tried to be helpful. They lasted hours. Until Amina Okoye arrived. She moved through her duties invisible and silent. She dusted without looking. She adjusted cedarwood candles back to precise angles. She existed in the space between visibility and erasure. One Thursday evening, Kang Min-jae was leaving his study when she passed him in the hallway, carrying water glasses. The light hit her ankle at a specific angle. Everything stopped. His body moved before his mind could catch up, stepping in front of her. His expression shifted into something she'd never seen before. Not anger, not fear, but a kind of collapse. "Your ankle," he said. His voice was barely a whisper. Amina froze. In 3 weeks, he had never addressed her directly. She said nothing. But she didn't try to hide it. The anklet caught the light again. Faded black thread, tiny silver clasp, the unmistakable craft of two children's hands binding what they had to keep. Kang Min-jae stared at it like a man staring at a ghost. "Where did you get that?" His voice had changed. The controlled precision was gone. There was only rawness. "From a boy," Amina answered quietly, "who promised me he'd remember." Everything in the hallway fractured. Subscribe to see how this unfolds and comment where you're watching from. I will love to say hello to you just to know how far our story is going. Kang Min-jae ruled from a building that didn't exist on any official map. It occupied the corner of a block in Seoul's financial district where 3 separate property records claimed different ownership, where surveillance cameras looped footage from 3 years prior, and where the security perimeter extended 2 blocks in every direction without anyone quite realizing it. The building itself was gray and severe. 40 stories of glass and steel that reflected the city back at itself like a warning. No one entered without clearance. No one left without forgetting what they'd seen. This was understood without being stated. This was the first rule of the underground. The things that happened in shadow were protected by the understanding that shadow was where you went when you wanted to cease to exist to the world above. He occupied the top 3 floors. The 38th floor was his office. The 39th was his private quarters. The 40th was something else entirely. A space no one had ever been invited to, where he kept the things he didn't want to remember and couldn't bear to destroy. On the morning of November 3rd, Kang Min-jae sat at his desk reviewing intelligence reports on a rival syndicate attempting to move into port territory. The reports were thorough. His security chief, a man named Park Sung-ho who had been with him for 15 years, had compiled them with the meticulous attention to detail that separated the living from the dead in this world. "They're positioning themselves to control the shipping lanes," Park said, standing at a respectful distance. "If they succeed, they'll have leverage over our import-export operations." Kang Min-jae didn't look up from the papers. His fingers traced the edge of a photograph. The syndicate leader's face, a man named Jo Taeyong who had ambitions that exceeded his intelligence. A dangerous combination, but a predictable one. How many men does he have? 87 confirmed. Another 40 or so unconfirmed. And his relationship with the politicians? 3 council members on his payroll. 2 police inspectors. 1 judge. Kang Min-jae set the papers down with a precision that suggested finality. Remove the variables. Park didn't ask which variables. He'd learned years ago that questions were a form of hesitation, and hesitation was a form of weakness. He bowed slightly and turned to leave. Park. He stopped. Make sure it's clean. I don't want this appearing in the news cycle. I don't want the other syndicates thinking we're vulnerable. I don't want anyone knowing we even knew about this. Yes, sir. And Park, the judge. Make sure his death looks natural. Heart attack, perhaps. He's 61 overweight. Entirely plausible. Park left without another word. By nightfall, 3 council members would be dead in a car accident. 2 police inspectors would take their own lives in a coordinated suicide pact. The judge would suffer a sudden coronary while dining alone at his favorite restaurant. Jo Tae-young would find himself with no allies, no protection, and no future. Within a week he would either flee Seoul entirely or simply disappear, the way men did when the man who ruled the shadow decided they were no longer useful. This was business. This was the cost of territory. This was the price of power. Kang Min-jae had stopped counting the cost years ago. He turned back to his desk and the mountain of documents that required his attention. A shipment delayed in Busan. A gambling operation in Itaewon requiring restructuring. A nightclub owner who had skimmed from the weekly take and needed to be reminded why that was a terminal decision. There were always problems. There were always solutions. The only variable was the speed at which the solution was implemented. At 42 years old, Kang Min-jae had perfected the art of existing without feeling. It was a skill he'd learned early, refined through years of necessity, and elevated to an art form through sheer discipline. Every emotion was a liability. Every sentiment was a weakness. Every moment of hesitation was a moment your enemy could exploit. He had eliminated hesitation from his repertoire entirely. His office reflected this philosophy. The walls were bare except for a single landscape painting, a winter mountain rendered in grays and blacks, beautiful only in its absolute refusal to comfort. His desk was empty of photographs, reminders, or any personal artifact. The furniture was functional. The lighting was clinical. Everything in this space was designed to support the work of a man with no interior life, no history, no connection to anything that would distract from the business of ruling. In the 39 years before he'd taken control of this empire, there had been another Kang Min-jae, a boy who laughed, who believed in things, who made promises he meant with the desperation of someone who had nothing else to offer. That boy had died the night he left Busan. He had been necessary to eliminate. Sentiment was a disease, and that boy had been infected with it. The man who remained was stronger, sharper, infinitely more efficient, and infinitely more hollow. But he didn't think about hollow. He didn't think about anything that wasn't immediately related to survival and power. He certainly didn't think about Busan. The morning of November 3rd was also the morning that Amina Okoye received her employment contract from Director Park of the premier household staff agency. The contract was specific. 1 position, 1 client, 1 estate. The salary was triple what she made at her previous household, and the conditions were simple. Don't be seen. Don't be heard. Don't exist. She had read the contract 3 times before signing it. Amina had always been good at not existing. It was a skill she'd developed out of necessity, the way some people develop the ability to go without sleep or food or hope. Invisibility was survival. Invisibility meant no one hurt you because no one noticed you. Invisibility meant you could move through the world without collision, without risk, without consequence. She was 28 years old, and had spent the last decade perfecting the art of not being there. The agency office was small and professional, located in a nondescript building above a laundromat in Portland. Director Park was a woman in her 50s with silver hair, and the kind of face that suggested she'd seen every human failure, and found them all equally mundane. She'd hired Amina without asking questions, which meant she'd already run the background check, and found nothing remarkable. Amina had learned to make sure there was nothing remarkable to find. Your last employer gave you exceptional marks, Director Park said, sliding the contract across the desk. In 5 years, I've never had a single complaint about your work. Not one. In this business, that's the highest compliment possible. Amina didn't respond. Responses were optional when invisibility was the goal. This new position is different, Park continued. The client is particular. He has very specific requirements and the previous staff couldn't meet them. He fired 5 people in under 10 minutes. Amina's eyes flicked up briefly. 5 people. Under 10 minutes. What were they doing wrong? Park leaned back in her chair. Existing. That's what you need to understand about this job. He doesn't want a housekeeper who makes suggestions or improvements or who leaves any trace of having been present. He wants a ghost. Someone who cleans his house, maintains his schedule, anticipates his needs, all without ever being seen, heard, or acknowledged. Can you do that? Amina thought about it. Not because she was considering whether she could do it, but because she was considering whether she wanted to do it. The salary was substantial. The work was clearly isolated. And isolation meant safety. Yes, she said. Park smiled slightly. I thought so. That's why you're here. The Iron Estate was everything Amina expected and nothing like she'd imagined. She arrived at 5:30 a.m. on a Monday in early November, when the fog still clung to Seoul, and the city felt like something rising from a dream. The estate sat on the edge of the Gangnam district, a massive modernist structure of steel and glass that seemed to repel the morning light rather than reflect it. The security detail stopped her at the gate. 3 men, all of them carrying weapons concealed well enough that she wouldn't have noticed if she wasn't someone who'd learned to notice everything. They checked her identification against a list and waved her through without speaking. She'd learned years ago not to expect people to acknowledge her. The grounds were meticulously maintained, not warm or welcoming, but precise. Every hedge trimmed to an exact height. Every stone pathway swept clear of debris. The gardens were designed to be looked at rather than experienced, beautiful in the way that winter is beautiful, stark, unavoidable, and emotionally distant. The housekeeper who was training her, a woman named Mrs. Kwon who looked like she'd been designed by someone who understood efficiency, but not joy, showed her the routines with the kind of detail that suggested either obsessive-compulsive disorder or a very clear understanding of what happened to staff who didn't meet standards. The cedarwood candles in the study must be placed at precisely 3 inches from the edge of the desk, Mrs. Kwon said, holding a ruler to demonstrate. Not 2 inches. Not 4. 3. The lighting in the bedrooms must be set to exactly 40% brightness. The kitchen surfaces must be cleaned with this specific solution, in this specific order, using only microfiber cloths. The laundry must be completed by 3 p.m., pressed by 4 p.m., and hung in the closet in size order by 5 p.m. Everything was precision. Everything was control. Everything was about maintaining a specific vision of order that went beyond cleanliness into something that looked almost like theology. Why? Amina asked quietly. Mrs. Kwon stared at her. Because those are his requirements. But why does he require them? That's not our concern. Our concern is compliance. Amina understood. Compliance meant employment. Compliance meant that you did the job and collected your pay and didn't ask questions about the man who demanded such specific order from his world. She moved through her first week with the kind of invisible precision that had become second nature. She arrived before sunrise, worked in silence, left after the household had settled for the evening. She cleaned the cedarwood candles and replaced them at exactly 3 inches from the edge of the desk. She adjusted the lighting to 40% and ran the washing machine on the precise cycle that Mrs. Kwon had demonstrated. She became a function, a service, a presence so complete in its absence that she might have been a ghost. The estate was organized like a fortress designed to keep feeling out. The paintings on the walls were all landscapes, no human figures, no emotional content. The music that played in the background was classical instrumental, never lyrics, always controlled. The books in the study were all philosophy and business strategy. There were no photographs, no letters, no evidence that the man who lived here had any connection to the world beyond the immediate radius of his power. But Amina noticed things. Invisibility gave her access to observation that normal interaction would have prevented. She noticed that there was a specific type of tea in the kitchen that he drank every morning at exactly 6:15 a.m. She noticed that he took the same route through the estate every evening at 8:30 p.m., as if guided by an internal clock. She noticed that there was a room on the 40th floor that she was never permitted to enter, and that he spent at least 1 hour there every night before sleeping. She noticed, in other words, that beneath all the precision and control, there was a man who was deeply afraid of something. On his third day in the household, Amina made a decision that violated the primary rule she'd been given: don't be noticed. She made an adjustment. In the study, where the vanilla candles had been abandoned in a closet, she found cedarwood. The previous maid had disposed of the candles that he preferred, replacing them with something cheaper, something that someone thought would make the space feel warmer. Amina removed the vanilla. She replaced it with cedarwood. She set the candles at precisely 3 inches from the edge of the desk and adjusted the lighting to 40%. It was a small act of defiance. It was an act of recognition. It was her way of saying, I see you. I understand what you want. I will give it to you without you having to ask. She didn't know if it was a mistake. But the next evening, when she passed through the study to do the evening cleaning, she found that he'd noticed. The candles had been moved slightly, as if he'd examined them, and the scent in the room had shifted from the cloying sweetness of vanilla to the clear, grounding scent of cedar. He knew someone had changed things, and he hadn't fired her. Days turned into weeks. The pattern of the household established itself. Early mornings, meticulous work, complete invisibility during his waking hours. Amina learned the rhythm of the estate like she was learning a language spoken without words. She understood that Thursdays were meetings days, and required the formal dining room to be prepared. She understood that Mondays were for paperwork and required the study to be left completely undisturbed. She understood that Tuesday evenings something happened that made him pour himself whiskey at midnight, and stand at the windows looking out at the city without seeming to see it. She didn't know the details of his life. She didn't know what kind of work he did, or why he required such complete control over his environment. She knew better than to ask. But she understood, through the small details of his existence, that he was a man living at war with something internal, something that invisibility and precision and cedarwood candles couldn't quite eliminate. And then in the third week of her employment he came home early. It was a Tuesday. Not a Tuesday evening, but a Tuesday afternoon, around 4 o'clock, when Amina was completing the laundry and hanging clothes in size order in the closet. She heard the car pull up to the garage. She heard the front door open. She heard his footsteps crossing the marble entryway, more rapid than usual, less controlled, as if something had thrown off his internal rhythm. She moved immediately into invisibility mode. She pressed herself against the wall of the closet, making herself smaller, making herself nothing. This was the rule. If you encountered him, you became transparent. You acknowledged his presence through your absence. But he was moving through the house with a kind of restlessness that suggested he wasn't looking for perfect order right now. He was looking for something else. He came to the laundry room. Amina held her breath. He stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the meticulously organized room, the clothes hanging in precise rows, the baskets sorted by type and size. He didn't speak. He didn't acknowledge her presence. But she could feel him observing, analyzing, trying to understand something about the space. Then he turned and walked away. Amina released her breath slowly. She had passed the test of invisibility. She had been in the same room with him and he had, functionally, not seen her. But something had shifted. She could feel it in the quality of the silence that followed his departure. He was aware, now, that someone was taking care of these details. Someone had removed the vanilla candles. Someone was hanging his clothes with precision. Someone was creating order in the chaos of his day. Someone had noticed him. And that simple act of recognition was the most dangerous thing that could happen in a place built entirely on the principle of not being seen. Amina didn't understand it yet. But the shape of something was beginning to form. The outline of a story that would eventually demand to be told. That would eventually require both of them to stop being invisible and remember what it was like to be seen. For now, though, she was still just a maid in an estate that demanded invisibility. She finished hanging the clothes. She cleaned the laundry room. She moved through her evening duties with the same precision that had kept her safe for 28 years. But the anklet, the one thing she wore that broke the rule of complete invisibility, the one thing she couldn't bring herself to remove, felt heavier that evening. It felt less like a memory and more like a prophecy. It was a Tuesday afternoon in 1999 when everything changed. The city was Seoul, or what would become Seoul, though the boy who would grow up to control it didn't know that yet. He was 7 years old. His name was Min-jae, though no one called him by it except his mother, and she was dying. They lived in Busan, in a neighborhood that the maps of the city didn't quite include. It was the kind of place where official society ended and survival began, where the police didn't patrol, where children disappeared without investigation and nobody considered it unusual. His mother was a seamstress, or had been, before the sickness took her hands first and then the rest. She'd been beautiful once. He could see that in the way his father looked at her when he thought she wasn't aware. But beauty was a luxury that required health, and health had abandoned her somewhere between his 5th and 7th year. They lived in a single room above a restaurant that didn't pay them for the space, they just didn't charge them. The restaurant owner, a woman named Mrs. Lim, was someone's sister, someone's cousin, someone's obligation, which meant she was bound by kinship to feed them when the money ran out. In Busan, in that neighborhood, kinship was the only currency that mattered. His father had left when Min-jae was 6. That was the thing people in the neighborhood understood about fathers. They left. They couldn't stand the sight of failure, or they couldn't stand the weight of responsibility, or they discovered that the woman they'd promised their life to wasn't worth the promise. Min-jae didn't know which it had been. He only knew that one day his father had kissed his mother's forehead and said something about finding work in Seoul, and then he was gone. The kiss was the last time Min-jae ever saw them touch. So it was just his mother and him in that single room above the restaurant. And then, as her breathing became more labored and her eyes sank deeper into her face, it was just him. He learned to steal when he was 7. Not because he was evil, not because he had criminal inclinations, but because his mother was hungry and the food from Mrs. Lim's restaurant was no longer enough. He learned to move through the market with his small hands and his small size and his ability to make himself invisible. He learned to feel the weight of an apple in his pocket. He learned the specific moment when a vendor's attention was focused on a customer, and that was the opening to disappear into the crowd with another potato, another handful of rice, another piece of bread that was only slightly stale. He learned early that survival required becoming someone no one noticed. His mother died on a Monday. He remembered because Mrs. Lim mentioned that it had been a slow Monday, few customers, which meant she'd been able to spend more time sitting with his mother, feeding her water and cool cloths for her forehead, holding her hand while her breathing slowed to something that was almost not breathing at all. When it stopped, Mrs. Lim had wrapped her in a white cloth. Someone had said words that were meant to be religious, though they were delivered by a man who looked more drunk than spiritual. His mother was placed in the ground in a cemetery on the edge of the city, and Min-jae had stood there in clothes that were borrowed from another orphan, not quite fitting, not quite his, and tried to understand that the woman who had loved him, imperfectly but absolutely, was now under the earth and would never come back. He was 7 years old and completely alone. Mrs. Lim let him stay in the room for 2 weeks. She didn't explicitly say he could, but she also didn't say he couldn't. In a neighborhood like that, these things were understood. He had nowhere to go. The city had no systems to protect orphans. There was no government option, no institution that would accept him. His only choice was invisibility or death, and invisibility was easier. So he learned to make himself useful. He woke early and cleaned the restaurant before it opened. He moved tables and stacked dishes and swept floors. He made himself into part of the architecture of the space, something that was there but not noticed, necessary but not appreciated. He discovered that as long as he was useful, people were inclined to let him stay. But usefulness wasn't love, and the distinction became clearer every day. The girl arrived in autumn. She was younger than him, maybe 5 or 6, with dark skin and eyes that had already learned not to trust. She would sit there for hours, creating tiny objects that had no purpose, objects that seemed to be made for the pure pleasure of making something from nothing. He watched her from a distance at first. This was the rule of the neighborhood. You didn't approach people unless you had a reason. You didn't ask questions. You didn't create complications. But one afternoon, when winter was approaching and the hunger was becoming more constant and more difficult to ignore, they'd both gone for the same scrap of food at the edge of the market. An apple that had fallen and rolled. An apple that could have fed either of them, but not both. He'd been bigger. He'd been faster. He'd gotten it. But instead of walking away, he'd stopped. He'd cut the apple in half with a piece of broken glass he found on the ground. It took a long time, and the knife was dangerous, and he cut his thumb twice. But eventually, he had 2 pieces of apple, roughly equal, and he'd handed one to her. She'd taken it without speaking. But her eyes had changed. For just a moment, they'd held something other than suspicion. After that, they were together. Not in a formal way. Not in a way that required conversation or commitment. They just seemed to occupy the same spaces, and neither of them left. He would steal food, and they would eat together. She would make her objects from garbage, and he would watch her work. In the winter, when the cold became dangerous, they would huddle together in whatever shelter they could find, behind the restaurant, in a partially abandoned building once, in a shipping container that held just enough warmth to matter. They didn't have a language for what they were to each other. But they had each other, and in that neighborhood, that was everything. It was in the winter of that year that he made the promise. They were in the shipping container, both of them so cold that talking took energy they didn't have. But Amina had made something from wire and thread, something that she'd been working on for weeks. She'd twisted the wire into a shape, rough, imperfect, but clearly intended to be a circle. And she'd tied it with black thread that she'd unraveled from an old jacket. When she finished, she'd looked at it for a long time, and then she'd offered it to him. "What is it?" he'd asked. "An anklet," she'd said. "For luck." He'd looked at this creation made from nothing, this evidence that she could transform garbage into something that meant something, and he'd felt something break open in his chest. It was emotion, dangerous, inefficient, completely useless. But it was real in a way that nothing in his life had been real since his mother died. He'd tied it around her ankle, not his own. He'd understood, somehow, that this wasn't just an object. This was a promise being made in the only way 2 7-year-old orphans knew how. Not with words, but with actions. With choices. With the decision to give something valuable to someone else when you had nothing. And he'd made a promise that he didn't know how to keep. "I'll marry you when I'm rich," he'd said. "When I get out of here, when I'm old and I have money, I'll come back for you. I'll make you a queen. I'll make sure nothing bad ever happens to you again." She'd looked at the anklet on her foot, and then at him, and she'd nodded like she understood. Like impossibly she believed him. 3 months later he was gone. A man had come to the neighborhood. A man who moved through the streets like he owned them, who wore expensive clothes and expensive sunglasses, and who was clearly looking for something. He'd walked past the restaurant, paused, and then come back. He'd asked Mrs. Lim if she knew of any boys who were quick, smart, and had no family connections. Min Jae had heard this conversation from the kitchen. He'd understood what it meant before Mrs. Lim had even answered. An opportunity. A way out. A door that opened and might never open again. He'd said goodbye to Amina the only way he knew how, by disappearing. He'd left in the night so she wouldn't see him leave, so she wouldn't have to experience the moment of abandonment. He'd left her the half of the apple he'd been saving, and he'd left the memory of a promise that he would spend the next 35 years trying to make real. He didn't know if she was still alive. He didn't know if she remembered him. He didn't know if the anklet had lasted, or if she'd lost it years ago. Or if she'd died in that neighborhood like so many children did, without ever becoming anything more than a ghost. What he knew was that he'd made a promise to a 7-year-old girl in a shipping container in Busan. And that promise had followed him through every decision he'd made since. Even when he'd trained himself not to feel. Even when he'd eliminated emotion from his operating system. Even when he'd become a man made of stone and strategy and absolute control. The promise had stayed. Buried under 28 layers of survival and ambition and necessary cruelty. But still there. Still waiting. Still the only thing that felt like it might be true in a life built entirely on tactical deception. And then, on a Thursday evening in November, while leaving his study to attend a meeting with men he would eventually have killed for inconsequential betrayals, he'd seen her anklet. Time had stopped. The world had fractured. And for the first time in 35 years, Kang Min-jae had remembered that he was capable of feeling anything at all. After he saw the anklet, everything changed. Not visibly. Not in any way that someone from the outside world would have noticed. Kang Min-jae maintained his schedule with the same precision he'd always maintained it. He attended his meetings. He made his decisions. He ordered the removal of obstacles with the same detached efficiency that had become his trademark. But internally, something had fractured, and he was slowly, carefully, becoming someone else entirely. He began to notice her. Really notice her. The way she moved through the spaces of the estate like water, never rushing, never frantic, never drawing attention. The way her hands were careful and precise when she replaced the cedarwood candles. The way she had changed the scent of his home without his permission, and he had been grateful for it. The way she existed in his world without demanding anything from it. He watched her from a distance for 3 days without acknowledging her presence. This was its own form of torture. Being in the same space with someone and pretending they were still invisible, when they had just become the most visible thing in his entire universe. On the evening of the 4th day, he made a decision that violated every rule he'd constructed for himself. He created a situation that would force her to reveal herself. It was a test. It was a cruelty. It was also, he realized too late, completely necessary. He spilled wine on the study floor deliberately. A full glass, dropped with the precision of someone who was actually stumbling, creating a stain that required immediate attention. Then he left the room and waited. She came within minutes. He could hear her footsteps, quieter than anyone else's, careful not to intrude. She could have simply cleaned the stain and left. That would have been the rule of her invisibility. But instead she paused. He could feel her looking at him, considering something. And then incredibly she spoke. "Is everything all right, sir?" It was the first time she'd addressed him directly. Her voice was quiet but not uncertain. There was something in her tone that suggested she understood exactly what he was doing. She was calling him on the test. She was acknowledging that they both knew the rules had changed. He turned to look at her fully, and for the first time since seeing the anklet, he allowed himself to really see her. Not as a maid. Not as a function. But as a person who had chosen to be invisible so that she could survive. The same way he had chosen it. "I'm fine," he said. "Thank you." "Let me clean that," she said, moving past him with a cleaning cloth. "Wait." She stopped. Her hand froze above the wine stain. In that moment, he could see her calculating. What was he going to do? Was she about to be fired? Had she violated some rule he hadn't explicitly stated? "The anklet," he said. She didn't move. She didn't turn around. But he could see her shoulders tense. "Where did you get it?" For a long moment, she didn't answer. Then, "It's a personal item." "I know what it is. I know where it came from. I'm asking you to tell me." She turned to face him then. And her eyes, those careful, guarded eyes that had learned not to hope, met his directly for the first time. In that moment he saw recognition. She knew. She had always known. The question was whether she was going to admit it. "A boy," she said quietly. "In Busan. A very long time ago." The room stopped existing. There was only her face, her eyes, the terrible, fragile truth that had been walking through his home for 3 weeks without either of them acknowledging it. "His name?" he asked. "Min-jae." He closed his eyes. When he opened them again, something in his expression had shifted entirely. The controlled mask had cracked. What was underneath was raw and desperate and utterly alive. "It's really you," he whispered. "I should finish cleaning," she said, but she didn't move. She was giving him a choice. She was allowing him to decide whether he wanted to acknowledge what they both knew, or whether he wanted to retreat back into the safety of invisibility. He should have chosen invisibility. He should have closed his eyes and let her clean and pretended this conversation had never happened. Feeling was a luxury. Instead, he stepped toward her. "Why are you here?" "I needed work." You knew I was here. You knew who I was. Yes. Why didn't you leave? She looked at him with an expression that suggested the answer was obvious. Because you became the man I wanted to know. Because even though you tried to stop feeling, even though you built walls made of cruelty and control, I could see that underneath it all, you were still the boy who gave me half an apple in the winter. The boy who promised me that if he survived, he would make me a queen. He reached out then, not touching her, just extending his hand into the space between them. An offering. A question. A bridge. She didn't take it. Instead, she finished cleaning the wine stain. She moved toward the door. And she said, without turning back, "Find me when you're ready to stop running from what you feel." After she left, he stood alone in the study, smelling the cedarwood that she'd brought back into his life, and for the first time in 35 years, he allowed himself to cry. Over the next 2 weeks, something shifted in the underground. Rumors began to spread. The Kong Min-jae, the man who never showed weakness, the man who could eliminate rivals without a change in his expression, was distracted. He'd canceled meetings. He'd delayed operations. He'd made one decision. Regarding a distribution network in Incheon, that contradicted his own strategic interests. Someone had gotten to him. Or he was losing his mind. Or, most dangerous of all, he was Men who had lived in fear of him for years began to whisper about opportunities. Competitors began to circle. 3 different syndicates started moving pieces into position, testing the edges of his territory to see if the armor was truly weakening. Park Sung-ho, his security chief, came to him with reports of these movements. He recommended immediate action. Remove the competition before they became confident. Reassert dominance. Remind everyone why they were afraid of him. Kong Min-jae did nothing. This was interpreted, correctly, as a sign that something fundamental had changed. The threats became more explicit. One of his warehouses was firebombed, a warning. One of his business associates received a specific threat against his family. Another syndicate made a move toward one of his nightclubs. These were the gestures that preceded open war. These were the rituals that surrounded the falling of kings. And through it all, he continued his routines as if nothing had changed. He attended his meetings. He conducted his business. He existed in his estate, and she continued to move through it like a ghost. And something between them intensified with each passing day. They didn't speak again. The conversation in the study had opened something that couldn't be closed, but it had also revealed that words were dangerous. Words were commitments. Words were admissions. Instead, they communicated through small gestures. He left a book on the kitchen table, poetry, which she'd never known him to read. She adjusted the lighting in his study differently, creating a warmth that suggested care rather than precision. He left a note that simply said, "I remember." She left no note in return. But one morning, she had prepared his favorite tea exactly the way his mother used to make it, with honey and jasmine flowers, and when he drank it, he tasted his entire childhood in a single cup. This was dangerous. This was the exact kind of sentimentality that destroyed organizations. This was the vulnerability that his enemies would exploit without hesitation. He knew all of this. And he did nothing to stop it. By the 3rd week, Park Sung-ho was openly concerned. In a private meeting in the office on the 38th floor, he made his position clear. "Sir, we need to act. The competitors are becoming bolder. The political connections are shifting. We're losing leverage by the day. If you don't reassert dominance soon, we're looking at a potential restructuring of power." "And if I act?" Kong Min-jae asked. "Then we remind them why they're afraid of you. We eliminate threats. We strengthen the hierarchy." "At what cost?" Park hesitated. This was not the kind of question his employer normally asked. The cost of doing nothing is greater than the cost of acting. Kong Min-jae stood and walked to the window. Below him, Seoul glittered in the afternoon light. The city that he'd built his empire on the foundation of. The city that feared him. The city that would continue to fear him as long as he maintained the machinery of cruelty and control that had created his power. "Prepare a response," he said finally. "But don't execute it until I give the order." This was a reprieve, not a capitulation. But it was the first time he'd hesitated. The first time he'd suggested there might be other options beyond dominance and elimination. The crisis came at a charity gala. These events were part of the architecture of his public existence. Events where he appeared as a legitimate businessman, where politicians and corporate leaders and the wives of important men could see that he was refined, educated, cultured. Events where he blended seamlessly into the world of legal power, while maintaining his empire in the shadows. The gala was held at the Seoul Grand Hotel, in a ballroom designed for the display of wealth. 300 people, all of them connected to money and influence in one way or another. All of them, on some level, aware of what he was. All of them willing to dance with him anyway because the alternative was to be excluded from power entirely. He arrived alone as he always did. He moved through the crowd with the same controlled precision that characterized all his movements. He made conversation with people who wanted to prove they could touch the dangerous thing without being consumed by it. And then he saw her. She was there as part of the catering staff. Of course she was. Director Park had placed her there, probably without knowing the significance. Amina was moving through the crowd with a tray of champagne, invisible again, performing her role with the same perfect precision. She performed every role. But she was visible to him. Absolutely, completely visible. And he suddenly understood why he'd been so distracted. Why he'd allowed his empire to become vulnerable. Why he'd stopped caring about the machinery of his power. Because real power wasn't dominance. Real power was standing in a room full of 300 people who feared him, looking at one woman who represented his entire childhood, and knowing that she mattered infinitely more than any of them. Someone bumped her as they took a champagne glass. Someone else made a crude comment about the staffing service. She remained invisible through it all, but he could see the exhaustion in her shoulders. The weight of being unseen by everyone except him. And then a man, a politician named Choi who was connected to one of the syndicates moving against him, deliberately knocked the tray from her hands. Champagne glasses crashed to the floor. The sound of them breaking echoed through the ballroom. Every eye turned toward the sound. Every eye turned toward her. How clumsy, Choi said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. He was making a point. He was testing whether Kang Min-jae was still in control of his world. He was demonstrating that the maid, connected to the boss, somehow, if the rumors were true, was vulnerable. Which meant the boss was vulnerable. The room went silent. Amina bent to clean up the broken glass. And that was when her sleeve rode up. That was when her anklet became visible to everyone in the ballroom. Not hidden. Not secret. But displayed to 300 people, including the political elite of Seoul. And it was distinctive. Handmade. Crude. The exact opposite of anything the people in this room would wear. It was visibly poor. Visibly made by a child. Visibly connected to a life that had nothing to do with wealth and power. Kang Min-jae saw the moment of recognition spread through the crowd. People were exchanging looks. People were whispering. They were beginning to understand that something profound had shifted. That the man who had built an empire on the principle of not caring about anything except power had just been revealed as caring, deeply, about a maid. About a woman. About love. This was the worst thing that could happen. This was the exposure he'd been trying to prevent. This was the vulnerability that would destroy him. And he did the only thing he could do. He walked directly across the ballroom, stepped over the broken glass, and knelt in front of her. Not to help her clean, but to retrieve the anklet. To acknowledge it publicly. To declare, in front of every person who mattered in Seoul, that this thing, this crude, handmade, invisibly precious thing, was worth more to him than his entire empire. He held her ankle gently. He looked at the anklet like it was a crown. And he said, clearly enough for the entire room to hear, "This belongs to me. She belongs to me. And I will destroy anyone who treats her as anything less than a queen." The room erupted. Phones came out. Within an hour, the image would be everywhere. The Mafia boss on his knees in front of a maid. The Mafia boss, protecting someone instead of ruling. The Mafia boss, choosing love over fear. The foundation of his power had just been publicly exposed as something else entirely. He helped her up. He led her out of the ballroom, ignoring the questions, ignoring the cameras, ignoring Park Sung-ho's frantic attempts to manage the situation. They moved through the hotel and into the private elevator that would take them to the penthouse where he'd arranged a room. Once they were alone, he turned to face her fully. He was breathing hard. His controlled mask had completely disintegrated. "I'm sorry," she said immediately. I wasn't trying to. Don't apologize. Don't you dare apologize." He pulled her close. Not roughly. Carefully. As if she might break if he held her too tightly. "I spent 35 years becoming a man who could survive anything. I eliminated feeling because I thought it was weakness. I built an empire on the foundation of not caring about anything except power." He pulled back so he could see her face. "And then you walked into my estate, and you brought cedarwood candles back into my life, and you made me feel something that I thought had died along with the boy I used to be." "You're still that boy," she said softly. "Underneath everything. That's why I'm here. That's why I came. I'm a dangerous man, Amina. I've done things that can't be undone. I've made choices that will haunt this city for years. And now that I've claimed you publicly, you're connected to all of it. My enemies will target you. My past will become your burden." "I've always been dangerous," she said. "I've always lived in a burden. At least this burden comes with someone who sees me. Someone who remembers me. Someone who loves me. I do love you. I never stopped. Every choice I made for 35 years was, in some twisted way, about honoring the promise I made to you in that shipping container." He took her hand and placed it against his chest. "But now I have to choose. I have to choose whether I protect the empire or protect you. I can't do both. They're mutually exclusive now." She didn't hesitate. "Choose me. Choose us. Choose what we could be if you stop running from what you feel." He held her while the world outside began to collapse. The image of him on his knees in front of her was spreading. The speculation about her identity was beginning. The syndicates were interpreting his public display of vulnerability as an invitation to move against him. Everything he'd built was cracking. And for the first time in his life, he was grateful. By morning, it was clear that his empire was failing. The political connections that had protected him for years were withdrawing their support. The police were suddenly interested in investigating operations that they'd previously ignored. The criminal syndicates were openly moving to take control of his territory. He had perhaps 48 hours before the machinery of his downfall became irreversible. Park Sung-ho came to him with the options. They were minimal. "We can fight," Park said. "We still have enough men and resources to hold territory for a few weeks. But it won't last. Eventually, they'll overwhelm us. Or we disappear. We liquidate what we can, we take the money. And we leave the country. You could start again somewhere else. Some other city. Some other country where your name doesn't carry weight." Kang Min-jae considered this. A year ago, this would have been unacceptable. A year ago, he would have fought to the last man, would have destroyed rather than retreated, would have chosen death over the loss of power. But a year ago, he hadn't remembered what it felt like to be in love. "Where is she?" he asked. "Safe. In the penthouse. Guarded." "Remove the guards. Tell me the fastest way to get her out of the country." Park's expression shifted. For the first time he looked uncertain. "Sir. I'm not asking for options, Park. I'm telling you what we're going to do. Liquidate everything. Take the money. And make arrangements for both of us to disappear tonight. What about the organization? What about the men who have depended on you for years? Tell them the truth. Tell them that their leader chose love over empire. Tell them that sometimes, the most powerful thing a man can do is to stop being powerful. Give them the option to join us or to take care of themselves." "But we're leaving." Park bowed slightly. It was the gesture of a man accepting an order he didn't agree with, but would follow anyway. "I'll make the arrangements." Kang Min-jae went to find her. She was in the penthouse, looking out at Seoul one final time. She changed clothes. She was no longer a maid. She was no longer invisible. She was simply herself, a woman who had survived poverty and invisibility and the weight of a promise that had been made 35 years ago. "We're leaving," he said. "I know. Everything is gone. The empire. The power. The place I've built. I know. We'll have to start over. We'll have to rebuild from nothing. And there will still be people who want to destroy us. The choice I made was public. The syndicates won't forget it. We'll always be targets. I've always been a target, she said. I was a target the moment I was born in a world that didn't want me. I was a target the moment I became invisible, so I could survive. I was a target the moment I put on the anklet and came into your house knowing who you were. She turned to face him. The only difference now is that I'm a target with you. And that changes everything. He took her hand. It was the same gesture he'd made in the shipping container, all those years ago. An offering. A promise. I'll make you a queen, he said. You already did, she answered. The moment you knelt in front of 300 people and chose love over fear. They left Seoul that night. They took a car to the airport. They traveled on documents that Park Sung-ho had arranged, identities that would let them disappear into the world without leaving a trace. Behind them, the empire he'd built slowly collapsed. The criminal syndicates fought over the remaining territory. The political connections that had protected him for years scrambled to distance themselves from his name. Within a month, Kang Min-jae's organization had effectively ceased to exist. Within a year, he was forgotten. The newspapers moved on to other stories. The underworld reorganized itself without him. Seoul became a city where his name meant nothing. A ghost story told to frighten people. A cautionary tale about what happened when power became less important than love. But in a small city on the coast of Portugal, a man who had once been the most feared person in Seoul was teaching himself to be something else entirely. He was learning to be visible, to be known, to be, finally, fully human. And beside him, wearing the handmade anklet that had started it all, was a woman who had waited 35 years for a boy to become a man, and then had the incredible fortune of watching him choose to become human instead. She had said, once, that she wanted to be a queen. But what she discovered was that she'd never wanted the crown. She'd only ever wanted to be seen. And now finally she was, not by the world, not by the people who had ignored her for so long, but by the one person who had ever really mattered. And that was enough. That was everything. Subscribe to see how this unfolds and comment where you're watching from. I will love to say hello to you just to know how far our story is going. From the moment a boy made a promise in a shipping container to the moment a man knelt in front of 300 people to honor it. This has been the story of what it means to choose love when the world demands power. It has been the story of two invisible people learning that the most courageous thing you can do is stop hiding. And it has been the story of a man who built an empire on the foundation of not feeling anything at all, discovering that real strength, true unbreakable strength, comes only when you're willing to feel everything. This is where empires fall. This is where true power begins.